Slave Voyages website, hosted by Emory University during more than a decade, and since early 2021 by Rice at www.slavevoyages.org, is the result of long-standing collaborative research conducted to elucidate the debates about the volume and direction of the transatlantic slave trade, building on a scholarship published since Philip Courtin's The Atlantic Slave Trade, a Census in 1969, and from the work of other scholars who published even before Courtin. The launching of the online transatlantic slave trade database in 2008 in the Slave Voyages website was the result of 15 years of improvements in the digital methodologies encouraging collaboration between specialists. The development of this first database applied quantitative methods and statistical software to consolidate information on slaving voyages connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas from the 1500s to the 1860s. These collaborations started with the study of the traffic of captives within the Anglophone world in the 1990s, when scholars in the United Kingdom and the United States started to consolidate information. Later, in the early 2000s, scholars and primary sources of the Luso-African Brazilian Atlantic became central to this project, which showed West Central Africa as the main site of embarkation of captives, as well as Brazil as the main site of disembarkation in the entire history of this traffic. In the last decade, the research on the traffic to the Spanish colonies became one of the main thrusts behind the addition of previously unknown transatlantic voyages to this dataset and to the creation of an entire new dataset on the slave trade within the Americas, the Intra-American Slave Trade Database. Four complex characteristics about the traffic to the Spanish America have probably contributed to this delay on the comprehensive examination of the Spanish Atlantic traffic, compared to how scholarship early consolidated knowledge about the British and Portuguese slave trading routes. First, the traffic to the Spanish Americas was the longest lasting slave trade, spanning from the first vessels embarking captives in Africa to disembark them in Puerto Rico in 1520, to the last slaving ships propelled by steam power landing captives in Cuba in 1866. Note that enslaved and free people of African ancestry arrived before 1520 to the New World, but they embarked in the Iberian Peninsula rather than in Africa. Second, perhaps more than 1/4 of all captives who arrived to the Spanish colonies were embarked in other colonies of the Americas, belonging to other European powers rather than in Africa. This complicates the research of these slave routes across archives of different colonial empires. Third, more than 20 archives in the Americas, Europe, and to a lesser extent Africa, store data on the traffic to the Spanish Americas, which requires the collaboration of several scholars from the Old and the New World to conduct comprehensive examination. And fourth, the scholarship of the slave trade to the Spanish America usually has been confined to national boundaries in Latin America and Spain, coming as part of the national history from local archives and local historiographies, or as part of the 19th century colonial ties between Spain and Cuba. This presentation examines some of the various sources of the trafficking of captives to the Spanish colonies, as well as describe a certain lag between the scholarship in Spanish and English to these topics, which I suggest is due to the challenges of multi-site archival research, nationally bounded scholarship interests, and inequalities in terms of research funding. Likewise, I provide some reflection on the slave trade to colonial Spanish America, the links of this horrific commerce with the rest of the Spanish Atlantic trade, and the importance of the trans-imperial and internal slave routes in the Americas. Scholars who examine the history of the slave trade and slavery have usually received these questions at conference from the public about the existence of historical sources on the slave trade, implying that these sources are inexistent or that they have disappeared. The answer often is surprising. Because captive Africans were seen as properties by captors and merchants, and as a property of high value in the Atlantic trade as well as the interior of the Americas, records about enslaved Africans and their descendants abound in the archives of the colonial state and the church in metropolitan Spain and the Spanish Americas. In the archives of the Catholic Church, enslaved men, women, and children appear primarily in baptism and marriage records, in separate books or alongside the free population. Although the parish sources, due to their characteristic, lack a consistent information on the arrival of slave ships, these documents provide significant clues, along with other sources, about the origin of the Africans as well as about their journeys across the Atlantic and the Americas. Marriage records, where witnesses provided by the bride and groom had to testify about the status of single of the spouses, provide data on forced migrations, on the African origins of spouses and how they met the witnesses, who on many occasions were shipmates in slave vessels, thus sharing the crossing of the Atlantic as well as slave routes internal to the Americas. Led by Jane Landers for almost 20 years, the Slave Society's digital archive has consistently reproduced and made available to the public this type of sources for Brazil, Cuba, and Colombia, among other places. Perhaps the most common source in state archives in Spanish America, the notary records, offer individual and sometimes collective entries on the buying and selling of captives in places as diverse as Mexico City and Santiago de Chile. Although the quantification of notary sources reveals the fluctuations of the slave market, both in volume and prices, as well as some characteristics of the enslaved, gender, approximate age, if they were born in Africa or in the Americas, these records rarely provide systematic information on the arrival of slave vessels. Scholars commonly quantify these sources in databases where the unit of data entry is the individualized subject of each sale, with categories of analysis such as gender and age. The records of taxes of colonial trade, such as alcabala, almojarifazgo, and averías, as well as the papers of the Royal Treasury and Consulado de Comercio, the Merchant Guild, provide an account of the maritime introduction of captives, generally identifying the information about the arrival of slave vessels, name of the ship, captain, owner, as well as itinerary and dates. However, because merchants tried to evade taxes, and exceptional royal measures such as the asientos, royal contracts, and licenses regulated the slave trade up to 1789, tax records are incomplete as a source for the study of this traffic. Visits of port authorities to arriving slave ships, as well as books of port entry when they survived, are probably the most comprehensive source on the arrival of slave vessels. However, for the large Hispanic American slave ports such as Havana, Cartagena, Veracruz, Portobelo, and even for smaller places such as Montevideo, these documents rarely have survived, and when they did, they only cover a few years indeed. Other colonial sources lacking connection with trade, such as Tomas de Razón, acknowledgement of official acts by colonial official notaries, sometimes recorded the arrival of slave ships. All these documents, both from the Royal Treasury and from the Capitanía de Puerto, the Ports Authority, are subject to quantification by considering the slave voyage as a unit of record, establishing different variables of analysis of Africans, gender, age, number, the captain and crew, as well as the itinerary and their dates, as they appear in the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database and in the Intra-American Slave Trade Database on the Slave Voyages website. In the documentary series of the Archivo General de Indias, the archive of the Spanish Empire in Seville, the section Indiferente General stores licenses and asientos, as well as correspondence and petitions to the crown, which offer information on the arrival of slave ships, as well as on the capture of enemy's vessels and the landing of slaves in Spanish colonies between the mid-17th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Also in AGI, in this archive, the sections on Casa de Contratación and Contaduría provide sources on departure of slave vessels from the Iberian Peninsula during the 16th and 17th centuries. The website of the Spanish State Archives, PARES, recently made available digital records of 656 slave ship departure, mostly from the 17th century. Records archives in the Iberian Peninsula complement the archives of the colonies. In fact, registries in metropolitan Spain commonly left unrecorded slave ships that instead were registered by colonial authorities, particularly in cases in which these ships didn't touch the Iberian Peninsula. In this way, research on this traffic must look to sources both in Spain and in the Americas, which implies that even for scholars who want to study the traffic to only one region, they must visit several archives in the Americas and Europe. The significance of local rather than empire-wide archives in the New World is particularly salient for the traffic of captives to Spanish America, conducted across the imperial boundaries. For instance, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database shows 550,000 enslaved Africans brought to the ports in the large coasts between Venezuela and Veracruz, encompassing the mainland colonies surrounding the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. In addition, the Intra-American Slave Trade Database shows 100,000 enslaved men, women, and children brought to these regions from the British, Dutch, French, and Danish Caribbean colonies, rather than direct from Africa. When we created the Intra-American Slave Trade Database during 2017 and 2018, it was launched in 2019, sources recording shipments of captives from other colonies to the Spanish mainland surrounding the Caribbean came predominantly from Greg O'Malley from British sources and Jelmer Vos from Dutch sources. We incorporated slave voyages recorded by Spanish language historiography, but then we didn't have time and resources to conduct research on Spanish language online primary sources. In 2020, an ACLS digital extension grant allowed us to consult some of the online initiatives of the Spanish American Archive. For instance, we explore sources available in the National Archives of Colombia, whose website displays digital images of documents of a section named Blacks and Slaves. This section includes all kinds of documents related to the life of Africans and their descendants in colonial New Granada, a larger colonial jurisdiction that included today's Colombia. In the early 21st century, this section was cataloged and digitized. The catalog offers the cover title of files involving everything from the arrival of slave vessels to slave rebellions. We examined this catalog and selected files which seemingly have information about the traffic of captives. And then we entered this data in the contributors interface of the Intra-American Slave Trade Database. This new information could be data on slave voyages which were already in the database, but we only had the departure from Jamaica or Curacao, to which we added the arrival in Cartagena. But we work on these sources also provided information on Caribbean slave voyages to Cartagena, which were unrecorded by British and Dutch sources. This task is unfinished, as we were not able to examine all files, but at least we found data on 100 Caribbean slave voyages to Cartagena and Portobelo, which were not in the database during the decades between 1740 and 1770. This work is slow because each file is about a single ship, which delays finding most of the information. Another complication for the examination of the arrival of captives and slave ships is the practice of contraband in the Spanish colonies. Contrabando was a term rarely applied to refer to illegal trade before the 19th century in Spanish America. Yet, contraband was not invisible to the documentary sources, as a good portion of contraband was post facto legalized. This is not the place to debate the concept of contraband for the Spanish Atlantic trade and the legal commercial conceptions of the time. But we can point out that in as much as there were different bodies of law, as well as subjects and group of subjects, such as the merchant guilds, merchants positioned themselves trying to employ different bodies of law in strategic ways to favor the introduction of merchandise and captives. In other words, what was smuggling for some colonial authorities was registered trade for others. Although it may seem as an oxymoron, legalized smuggling in the form of indultos or a payment of a fee by the merchant to the authority at the time of disembarkation was a common practice from Veracruz to Buenos Aires before the 19th century. Both the cases of legal smuggling and the judicial cases of plain smuggling reveal merchant strategies and complement the sources, the historical sources of slave arrivals that we have seen before, listed above. The archives offer records of confiscations where, for instance, in Buenos Aires, Spanish officers seized captives sent from Portuguese Colonia del Sacramento in boats crossing the Rio de la Plata or River Plate in mid-18th century. Records produced in Venezuela legalized the arrival and purchase of enslaved people who had been introduced previously, sometimes years before, as contraband from the island of Curacao. Rarely, this type of records offer information of the arrival of slave ships, but mostly because of the short distance between Colonia to Buenos Aires, as well as from Curacao to Venezuela, these are individual entries. Yet, these sources are very useful for estimating the total volume of trafficking and for making correlations on the volume of legal commerce, legalized contraband, and plain smuggling, as well as the relationship among these three forms of the slave trade. Correspondence between merchants, which has been rarely stored in the Spanish American archives is in comprehensive ways, contribute to discern between what the traffickers said they did, as recorded by documents of the Merchant Guild and colonial authorities, and what they actually implemented. Exceptional cases, among others, are the Simón Ruiz archive in the Museo de las Ferias, Medina del Campo, Valladolid, for the 16th century slave trade, and the Trucios and Reynals family papers in the National Archives in Santiago de Chile, which offer information of the traffic between the Rio de la Plata and Lima via Valparaíso. These sources not only reveal strategies of contraband, but also the links between the slave trade and other branches of commerce, such as the circuits of silver, sugar, tobacco, hide, and textiles, among others. Letters also reveal close relationships of slave traders with other merchants, not only within the Spanish realms, but also in Portugal, England, the Netherlands, and the United States. Correspondence and papers of foreign traffickers, as they brought enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies, also reflect various strategies of colonial trade and contraband. Such is the case of the archives of the De Wolf family in Bristol and the Vernon family in Newport, both in Rhode Island, where there are abundant historical sources on the trafficking to Cuba and to a lesser extent to the Rio de la Plata from the 1790s to the 1820s. For the rise and fall of the 19th century Cuban traffic, a plethora of sources exist, apart from those mentioned above, such as newspapers, as well as documents in the Cuban archives. What is new here is the documentation about the prohibition of this traffic in the National Historical Archive in Madrid, as well as those documents produced by the British Navy and the British Foreign Office in their attempts to limit the clandestine slave trade to Cuba. Records on the measures to prohibit this traffic in Cuba after 1820 offer a window into the clandestine slave arrivals up to 1860s. For instance, the website of the Spanish Archives, PARES, recently put online 126 files on these cases archived in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, indeed. Although this anthology of sources and archives illustrates the multiple possibilities for scholars to examine the slave trade in the Spanish Atlantic, this also constitutes a challenge as one of the features that have stalled the comprehensive examination of this traffic to the Spanish colonies as a whole. It is precisely this diversity of repositories. In addition to the three main Spanish archives, Archivo General de Indias in Seville, Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, and Archivo General de Simancas in Simancas, there are about 20 national archives in the republics of Spanish America that contain data on the slave trade in these countries, without counting municipal or ecclesiastical archives. Faced with this challenge, scholars in Havana or Buenos Aires can query the databases in the Slave Voyages website to contrast the research based in local archives to access information from archives in London, Lisbon, or Mozambique on this traffic, and even to be guided to identify what has been left out from these databases. When searching for slave arrivals to one region, scholars can see the list of sources that provide information on the region they want to study to check if the sources were already included in these datasets. In other words, they can check which sources are listed in these databases to consider whether their own records, the records of these scholars, provide new information. Apart from primary sources, it is also necessary to inquire into the building of national historiographies born from Spanish American institutions to understand certain views on this traffic more circumscribed to modern nation states than to the broader Spanish Atlantic. Limitation to Spanish language historiography on this subject can be found on the one hand by the historical conceptions circumscribed to modern nations, and on the other by the necessity of traveling abroad to conduct research in more than one country and in more than one language to build both databases and comprehensive narratives on the slave trade to the Spanish Americas. Given that the first semi-professional historians in countries such as Argentina, Uruguay, and Venezuela were generally lawyers and notaries, letrados a la Ángel Rama, some of their works analyzed the litigations initiated by captives within the legal framework of slavery and the legal structure of slave trade licenses. Only later they examined slave ship records, combining legal and statistical analysis. In the 1960s and 1970s, with the growing interest of socioeconomic history viewed by Marxist perspective, the methodologies of quantification increased. Although these studies are foundational, and for decades they were the only systematic works on the legal status of captives and the quantification of slave arrivals, they were circumscribed to the countries where the enslaved arrived. Belonging to a later generation, it is worth in highlighting the work of Enriqueta Vila Vilar, who was one of the first historians to draw a systematic overview on the slave routes to the Spanish colonies in the 16th and 17th centuries. As this work centered on the connections between Spain and the Caribbean, to some extent this excluded how these routes were shaped by the interaction of Spanish traffickers with other European merchants and colonies, which is central to explaining the 350 years of slave trade in the Spanish Atlantic. Similar studies based in Seville have focused on some asientos and companies, with narratives more centered on Spain than in the Americas, by examining metropolitan sources without consistent inquiry into the documents from the colonies. More recent examinations provide overviews of Spanish institutions and law regarding the slave trade and slavery, rather than examining the variations of this traffic across the Spanish colonies. Although the last 20 years saw an exponential growth of the research on the history of Africans and their descendants in the whole colonial Spanish America, produced by historians in Latin America, the United States, and Spain, studies on the slave trade have been limited to the links between Cuba, the Spanish Caribbean as a whole, and Spain. The 2013 edited book by Joseph Fradera and Christopher Smith Noguara has great contribution from historians working on Latin America. Although positioned to understand the Spanish Atlantic, almost all of the contribution examine the relationship between Spain and Cuba. The editors reflected in the introduction that, and I quote, Spain was the first Atlantic empire to establish sugar plantations in the American colonies, but it was also the last to engage directly in the transatlantic slave trade, and I end quote over that. This assertion underestimates the importance of the initial 16th and 17th century slave trade, as well as the Spanish participation in the overall 350 years of history of this horrific traffic. Likewise, this flattens the complexity of the internal trafficking of captives in regions like Mexico, Peru, and the Rio de la Plata, where the slave trade was very active well before the 19th century rise of the Cuban traffic, particularly on the agency of Spanish merchants, not in Spain, but in Spanish America. More recent edited volumes from research teams based in Barcelona and Seville provide a broader perspective more focused on change over time and regional nuances in the traffic of captives within the Spanish Atlantic. The histories of the Spanish Atlantic commerce rarely include the traffic of captives, given the exceptional racial measures of asientos and the connections of these contracts with the commercial circuits outside of the Spanish system. As Javier Lamikis points out, histories of colonial trade generally focus on a specific region, let's say Mexico or Venezuela, or trade institutions, the consulados or commercial companies. But rarely they examine individual and collective merchant networks outside of these institutions. Although the slave trade was closely linked to the circulation of silver and to the commerce and smuggling of merchandise, most of the trade took place outside of institutional frameworks like the consulados, the merchant guilds, and to a certain extent in conjunction with foreign merchants, which has contributed to the relative invisibility of the traffic of captives for the scholarship of the Spanish-American general commerce during the colonial era. Well, as concluding remarks for this presentation, I would like to point to two things. First, the recent addition of the Intra-American Slave Trade Database to the Slave Voyages website shows the capillarity of the slave trade routes in the Spanish America. With the new dataset of internal traffic, additional ports in the Spanish America were added to the website as destination of these internal slave routes. The prospect of incorporating slave routes of the Black Pacific, as well inland routes within Mexico and South America, constitute new challenges. While historians have charted some of the slave routes connecting Panama with Peru and Panama with Mexico, as well as Chile with Lima, a new round of collaborative research is needed to provide a systematic view of these coastal Pacific slave routes since the 16th century to the 19th century. The same is true to the inland routes from Veracruz to Mexico City and from Buenos Aires to Potosí, just to name some of them. One of the challenges of this website is to visualize inland slave routes, and perhaps other digital initiatives could be developed for the specific of this aspect of traffic within Spanish America. The Slave Voyages website is currently supported by a consortium of institutions: Emory, Rice, the Omohundro Institute, the Hanshin Centers at Harvard, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, And finally, the University of California campuses are Berkeley, Irvine, and Santa Cruz. These institutions provide a minimum of sustainability in the short term, with renewals every 3 years, which is essential for digital initiatives to subsist. The other factor securing the success of digital initiatives is their ability to innovate within the existing structures, which is our horizon that can be fulfilled with the further examination of the slave routes in Spanish America. And with this, I'm gonna leave over here. Thank you very much.